hope you can hear me well.
Se ακούμε, Chrysanthi. We can hear you.
Great. Okay, that's great. Okay, great. And now you can see me as well, which is great. So, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depends where you are actually now. I'm Chrysanthi Demetriou. I'm one of the organizers of this school and an instructor. And this, of course, the Classical Languages Summer School of the Theological School of the Church of Cyprus. First of all, I would like to welcome you all to this second extracurricular activity. This is a school which is actually, as far as we know, it's actually organized for the first time in Cyprus. And we're now about to move to our second week of classes. We've just finished our first week, and we think that it's going well, and we hope that it's going to be doing well until the end. So the idea behind the school was initially to welcome people to Cyprus from all around the world, and to actually combine language teaching with various cultural activities and sightseeing in Cyprus. Well, however, unfortunately, due to this current situation, we couldn't do that, so we moved everything online. But we decided to give you a glimpse of Cyprus, even from a distance. And today we are glad, we do have the pleasure to have a great scholar with us, who will guide us through Cyprus' modern history, and we really look forward to listening to his talk, which we're sure is going to be fascinating. So, Maria, would you like to say something as well?
So, hello, everyone. I am Maria Pavlou, and I am the director of the summer school. So, welcome to this a second lecture within the framework of the Classical Languages Summer School, which is organized, as Chrysanthi has said, by the Theological School of the Church of Cyprus. These lectures have been scheduled primarily for the participants of the summer school, but we subsequently decided to open up lectures with a Cyprus-related topic to the general public. Today, we have the honor and great pleasure to have with us Dr. Antonis Petrides, an associate professor in the program Studies in Hellenic Culture of the Open University of Cyprus, and currently the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. Dr. Petrides studied Greek philology, specializing in classics at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki in Greece, and read classics at Cambridge, from where he received his PhD. His research interests lie mainly in the field of Greek and Roman drama, Hellenistic literature, and Greek physiognomics. He is also interested in reception studies, in the theory and practice of long-distance adult learning, and in the teaching of ancient Greek language and literature in secondary education. His recent publications include a monograph titled Menander, New Comedy and the Visual, which came out in 2014 by Cambridge University Press, and several other collective volumes. He has also been involved in the reform of the national curriculum in Greek and Latin, and has edited and written several student textbooks and teaching guides. Currently, he's preparing a new commentary on Menander's play Diaskolos for Oxford University Press. He's also working on a commentary on Diaskolos in modern Greek to be published by Gihli Publications, and a monograph on new comedy to be published by Brill. Now, if I had to describe Dr. Petrides in just one word, that word would be polymath. I think that only this word captures his varied and versatile learning and the great scope and depth of his interests. As well as being an excellent scholar and classicist, Dr. Petrides is also a great teacher and educator, an acute literary and theater critic and essayist, a competent translator, and a prolific blogger. And his blog, Lotus Eaters, is a goldmine of knowledge on various topics related to drama and poetry in general. Moreover, he's an eloquent and skilled public speaker, an orator, and last but not least, a poet. And in fact, as I hear from some friends, he has also a great voice, even though I didn't have the chance to hear him singing myself. So today, Dr. Petrides will guide us on a journey through the modern history of Cyprus, specifically the period between 1960 1974 and its immediate aftermath. His focus will be not so much on the events per se that take place and unfold during this period, as on the reception and the poetic transmutation of these events. Dr. Petrides will draw his examples from the work of 4 of the most significant poets of the period under discussion who wrote in Greek: Kostas Montis, Pantelis Michanikos, Michalis Pashiardis, and Kyriakos Charalambides. All poems will be presented in original English translations by the speaker. And now, before I give the floor to our speaker, let me just underline the great importance of such translations. Those of you who are not from Cyprus or Greece, most likely you haven't heard of the above-mentioned poets before. The reason is not because these are minor poets or that they have not written great poetry, but mainly because their work has not been extensively translated into other major European languages. When Kostas Montis was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2000 and was asked during an interview how he was feeling, he expressed his grief because the Cyprus government didn't try to promote his work through translations. And this sadness and disappointment for the absence of recognition of Greek and mainly Greek-Cypriot poets finds an eloquent expression in a short but well-known poem of his. He says, "Few read us, few know our language. We remain without vindication or applause in this remote corner. Yet this is equalized, for we write in Greek. Good translations is the only bridge that could render the work of poets and writers writing in non-dominant languages known. Dr. Petrides has both an excellent grasp of the English language and poetic sensibility, a crucial combination for a good, and I would say even emotional translation. And I do hope that he will keep translating, thus rendering accessible great Greek and Greek-Cypriot poetry to non-Greek speakers. Dr. Petrides, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maria and Chrysanthi, my good friends, for the kind words of introduction and for inviting me today to speak about the modern history of Cyprus, specifically about the fateful 15 years between independence and the de facto partition of the island in 1974. There are 4 major milestones mapping the history of Cyprus in these years. It's the declaration of an independent republic in 1960, the intercommunal struggle of 1963 and 64, which was briefly reignited in 1967, the coup d'etat against Archbishop and President Makarios on July 15, 1974, and finally, the Turkish military intervention or invasion, which was completed in 2 rounds, first on July 20, 23, 1974, and then on August 14 to 16 of the same year. Here follows the story in a nutshell. Neither of the two ethnic communities of the island aspired to an independent Cyprus state. Both staunchly committed, as they were, to their antagonistic nationalisms. The wish of the Greeks, which numbered 82% of the population, was enosis, unification with Greece, for which they had just conducted a 4-year armed struggle against the British. The Turkish Cypriots, a minority of 18%, which had controlled the island until 1878, when the Ottoman Empire leased Cyprus to the British, wanted Taksim, partition. Declaring an independent Cyprus was the result of forceful pressures by the three eventual guarantor powers, the United Kingdom, Greece, and Turkey. Neither the Greeks nor the Turks of Cyprus entered this new covenant sincerely. Both considered the compromise as an intermediate stage towards the fulfillment of their own national aspirations, and both took measures towards promoting those aspirations on the ground, including preparations for a military showdown. The dysfunctional nature of the 1960 constitution, including but not limited to the thoroughgoing veto power afforded the Turkish vice president, led to the first major crisis in 1963. Archbishop and President Makarios' attempt to impose constitutional reform was regarded by Turkish Cypriots as a GC bid to hijack the state. The Turkish Cypriots seceded from all branches of government, and following island-wide clashes that resulted in hundreds of deaths on both sides, horrible atrocities, mostly perpetrated by the Greeks, and the first localized military intervention by Turkey, large chunks of the Turkish Cypriot population, more than 50% in total, isolated themselves in small pockets of land, occupying 1.5% of the island's territory. Intercommunal strife was briefly reignited in 1967. However, the 10 years leading to the Turkish invasion of 1974 was mostly a period of Greek-on-Greek violence. The Enosis faction grew increasingly dissatisfied with Makarios, for although he continued to pay lip service to the cause of Enosis, his policies were regarded as anti-unionist. Deeper, more personal resentments played their part as well, as much as the growing corruption of Makarios' inner circle. The military dictatorship inflicted upon Greece on April 21, 1967, caused the political rifts between Greek Cypriots to deteriorate fast into a bona fide civil war, which reached its peak in the period 1972-1974 with the foundation of the so-called EOKA B, Second EOKA, a small but lethal terrorist group initially led by General Georgios Grivas, the commander of the initial anti-colonial military organization EOKA, and later, upon Grivas' death in early 1974, by people answering directly to the Greek junta. The strategic objective of EOKA B was to enforce Enosis by assassinating Makarios, whom they now considered to be an unpretending enemy of the cause of unification with Greece. After 2 failed assassination attempts, and under direct orders by the new junta strongman Demetriou Ioannidis, the Cyprus National Guard, abetted by EOKA B, overthrew Makarios but failed to kill him. Makarios fled to the United Nations, from where he called upon the guarantor powers to restore constitutional order in Cyprus. Turkey obliged, but of course, restoring the 1960 constitution was not in her cards. The Turkish military intervention, invasion, as it called by the Greeks, peacekeeping operation in Turkish political lingo, concluded in nearly 6,000 dead, of which 1,619 were initially declared MIA, missing in action. 36% of the island's most fertile and economically productive territory occupied by Turkey, and 1/3 of the population being displaced from the north to the south. This lecture will guide you on a journey through this historical watershed I have briefly sketched. A decade and a half which transformed the island of Cyprus from a backward British colony into the only European country that still bears the marks of nationalist conflict and officially remains in a state of war emergency. We shall not explore events so much as attitudes, discourses and traumas refracted through selections from the work of the foremost poets of the period who wrote in Greek: Kostas Montis, Pantelis Michanikos, Michalis Pashiardis and Kyriakos Charalambides. The poems will be presented in original English translations by the speaker. To a large extent, the poems speak for themselves. Therefore, my commentary on each one will be kept to a minimum. The readings from Montis showcase the standard Greek-Cypriot response to the Turkish invasion as an unambiguous outrage, historical as well as moral. A pained and moving response, no doubt, but also admittedly simplistic and self-righteous. The choices from Charalambides display the harsh realities of displacement and the gaping wounds of the MIA. On a less forgiving, more self-accusatory note, the poems by Michanikos and Pashiardis speak about internal Greek-on-Greek and intercommunal strife, as well as that catastrophic cocktail of blind hatred, shameful incompetence, and criminal complacency which precipitated the disaster. Montis' poetry embodies an emotive but one-sided understanding of the events as an epic story of Greek Cypriots initially triumphant in pursuing their natural rights and eventually victimized by disasters that befell as a result of international conspiracies and foreign incursion. Charalambides contributes a more reflective story of human loss with overtones of Greek tragedy. Finally, in more iambic tones, Pashiardis and Michanikos flagellate the reader with harsh truths about history as a more complex game of actions and reactions, intersecting interests and shared guilt. One is justified to begin this journey with the patriarch of 20th century Greek Cypriot poetry, Kostas Montis, and follow the events in zigzag chronological order from the war of 1974 to its aftermath, and from there back to the dark era of internal strife, 1964, 1974, and its horrific climax, the coup d'etat. This zigzag order suggests itself because, hard as it is to fathom, given the myriad warning signs, to most Greek Cypriots even today, July 20, 1974 was the beginning rather than the end of a historical process, and an event that presented, unbelievable as it may sound, the shock value of a shattering surprise, a bolt out of the blue. Pantelis Michanikos' poem Onesilus will have more to say about that. In the official Greek Cypriot narrative, connections with events of the previous years, prior to 1974 that is, are being drawn mostly to be dismissed as pretexts for what is essentially seen as an act of piracy on the part of a greedy foreign aggressor, Turkey. The following short poems by Kostas Montis from his 1975 collection Embittered in Oneself are most revelatory of these dominant discourses. Kostas Montis, Moments of the Invasion. It is hard for me to believe that the Sea of Kyrenia brought them upon us. It is hard for me to believe that the beloved Sea of Kyrenia brought them upon us. How quickly did the summer realize that it was redundant and packed its bags and left on the tip of its toes. Lift your back and shake them off, my pentadactylos, my mountain of the 5 fingers. Lift your back and shake them off. The titular bitterness of Montis's 1975 collection is brought about by nothing other than the impression that the island's rightful ownership, Greek ownership, was violated. The Turks in Montis are monolithically them, and we, the Greeks, are identified with the island's land and sea, as time honored, that is, in our proprietary rights on the island, as is its internal ingredients, the land and the Sea of Kyrenia and Pentadactylos, not only for the obvious reason of having been the primary theatre of the war, but because the northernmost mountain range of Cyprus is associated with the legends of the Yenis Akritis, the Byzantine hero, a cornerstone of modern Greek national identity at large, who, in his struggle to evade death, Charon, left the mark of his fingers on the mountain's back. In Montis's poetry, the invasion was unequivocally a barbaric act of violence, practically unprovoked and entirely unjustifiable, directed at the most vulnerable and innocent. This discourse of victimization of the weak and few, the Greeks, by the strong and many, Turkey, is just as dominant a frame for the 1974 events as that of rightful ownership being infringed. The symbol of the child's toy in the next Montis poem, brutally destroyed upon the act of extending a final farewell to its owner, who has already fled, needs no lengthier commentary. Kostas Montis, Turkish Invasion 2. This doll with the severed hand dangling from the window of the crumbled house. What child did she wish to bid goodbye? To what child did she crawl to the window to wave her hand goodbye, and they cut it off? The discourse of victimization. Now, Kyriakos Charalambides, on his part, dispensing with the vociferous fury of Montis, offers a much more reflective, elegiac take on the 1974 events. In his most celebrated collection, Famagusta Reigning City, 1982, Charalambides focuses on the feelings of desolation and loss following the enforced displacements of the Greek-Cypriots from their ancestral homelands. Famagusta Reigning City is a love song and a dirge all at once for the poet's native city, which is reduced to the pitiful condition of a ghost town. In the poem Beginning of the Indiction, the poet embarks on a mind's journey back to the now dilapidated neighborhood of his youth. The word indiction is polyvalent. It denotes the beginning of the ecclesiastical year, thus of a new era for the poet away from his city. However, in the Roman and Byzantine empires, indiction was also the term for a 15-year fiscal cycle upon whose end the time of reckoning ensues. Mind you, 15 years indeed, from the end of the anti-colonial struggle in 1959, which was supposed to usher in an era of peace and liberty, to the fateful 1974. The indiction is a beginning, but it is also an end. Kyriakos Charalambides, beginning of the indiction. Who Pnitagoras is, we all know, or at least we all could learn. They say he was a king of Salamis. But Pnitagoras Street, my precious Pnitagoras, in between Timios and Agia Zoni, what that is, only I and only I can know. Who is me? I envy the rats of this road, the stray dogs, the wild cats, which coming from Acropolis Street and descending into Pantelis and Hilarions, disembark into my very own street of Pnitagoras. Lucky lads. I wish I could be my house's rat, the stray dog that enters my garden, and the wild cat that's opening the fridge to find his forgotten piece of chicken. If only I could be the snake and the nettle, the tree that withered, the broken door, amaranthine yearning falling dead, to sleep in the webs of a spider. In his next collection, titled Dome, 1989, Charalambides turns his attention to the hundreds of men and some children still missing in action, unaccounted for, constantly sought by their relatives, but most probably lying somewhere dead and unburied. Charalambides' poetry erects a dome of words, a poetic quasi-burial to compensate for the lack of a proper ceremony, a dome to resemble the position in the Orthodox Church where the casket would be placed during a funeral ceremony, but also to connote the heroic majesty of poetry itself. Poetry is the figurative mound that comes to cover the lost bodies of the beloved, as potently defiant of death as the ancient Mycenaean tholoi, chamber tombs, even if in actuality it is as nominal as the few specks of earth Antigone poured over the body of her brother Polynices in Sophocles' tragic play. The following two poems are typical samples of this collection, Dome, 1989. The first captures a documented scene from one of the many rallies organized in Nicosia in the first few months after the war to raise awareness for the issue of the MIA. A child is looking for his father holding his photograph in hand. Kyriakos Charalambides, child with a photograph. A child with a photograph in hand, a photograph in the profundity of his eyes, held upside down, was staring. Around the child a crowd, and he had in his eyes a small photograph, a big one on his shoulders and vice versa, a big one in his eyes, upon his shoulders a smaller one, and in his hands one even smaller still. He was amid a crowd screaming chants, and he was holding it upside down. It troubled me. I approached him by passing signs of loved ones, or arcs and voices frozen in time and all completely inert. The photograph bore some resemblance to his father. I set it straight, and still I saw the missing man with his head upside down, just like the king, the jack, and the queen, which, seen upturned, are found to be straight. This man as well, when looked at straight, turns upside down and stares. The second poem of Charalambides could be a miniature Greek tragedy or a scene straight out of the medieval folk ballads. A woman is getting married to a nice young man. Her father, one of the missing, is bent on attending the ceremony no matter what the material obstacles may be. The green line mentioned in the poem is the mark on the map of Nicosia dividing the island's capital since 1964. Mind you, 64, not 74. Kyriakos Charalambides at his daughter's wedding. She had 300 acres of occupied land and a father in the depths of Anatolia. Thankfully, she was marrying a nice lad. During the holy ceremony, nobody took notice of her father. He crept in through the narthex stealthily and stood behind a column, taking pride. Then he wiped off, using his sleeve, his torn and humbled tear. They took him for the village idiot and let him be. Concluded at the nuptials, and may your marriage be blessed. Wedding candy in hand, they enter, each their car, and they are off. The loving father, in his turn, proceeds to the green line, crosses over, bowing his head. He takes, once again, his place in the ground. Turning now to Michalis Pashiardis and Pantelis Michanikos, we shall read poetry that digs into the events within the Greek-Cypriot community that laid the ground for disaster. Primarily, the coup d'etat against Makarios on July 15, 1974, and leading up to that, the deleterious nationalism and the fantasy of total control over the island, entertained by the Greeks. Michalis Pashiardis' nightmarish poem, Nicosia, evening 15/7/74, captures the sudden metamorphosis of the island's capital, from the Mediterranean paradise of the poet's youth to a hellish maze of narrow streets where childlike adults brandishing real weapons are now playing death. Michalis Pashiardis, Nicosia, evening 15/7/74. Nicosia tonight is not the town of summer sweet, of the afternoon that lit the stars, the one we knew till yesterday, whose dew we drank in a glass. Tonight, in the narrow streets, they play death. Each corner, fire and struggle. Nicosia fights tonight and falls. The first of three poems by Pantelis Michanikos, with which this lecture shall conclude, deals with the bitter infighting, political at first, violent eventually, between Makarios, the old buddy or uncle of the next poem, with his ultra-nationalist opponents who accused him of betraying Enosis. These vipers were supposedly stripped of their venomous fangs, having entered themselves into a new covenant with the old body. Nonetheless, miraculously so, not only did the fangs reappear, but they proliferated, no less because of the old body's criminal negligence and tolerance. Pantelis Michanikos, we vipers. We vipers each have a pair of venomous fangs. When we decided at last to create a community of men, we decreed that each would remove, discard their two fangs. Time passed in shakedowns and readjustments, but something wasn't right. We discovered that each viper now had 3 or even 4 venomous fangs. The rest, those whose fangs had been stolen, were gone. I told the old body, next time, should we do it again, he must take out the fangs himself and make them disappear, fail-safe, no matter if they called him an enemy of the nation, a Chiliast, or any other abominable name, the vipers. The vipers of the poem, as mentioned, are clearly Makarios' opponents, but prima facie. The poem, after all, is titled We Vipers. There is something viperish in everyone involved, even in the poet that comments on the events. A measure of shared guilt, which could make even the old body's tolerance of the vipers look suspect. Why did he not take out the fangs himself? The warning signs that the fangs of the vipers were growing back were there for a significant amount of time, says Michanikos in the next poem. They were clear, visible and tangible, but disgracefully we chose to ignore them. In the poem Onisilus, Michanikos adopts the mythical methods of the modernists, using a historical avatar, the titular Onisilus, to speak of the 10-year period preceding the Turkish invasion, in which countless crystal clear signs that a major event was bound to happen in Cyprus, unless measures were taken to thwart it, were completely and utterly dismissed. Onisilus is a figure from the ancient history of Cyprus, memorialized by Herodotus as the leader of an anti-Persian movement on the island in the early 5th century BC. Onisilus forced the Cypriots to join the rest of the Greeks in the so-called Ionian Revolt, taking no account of the balance of power or the divided sympathies of the Cypriots. Onisilus died heroically on the battlefield. As a warning against other potential conspirators, the Persians severed his head and placed it on a pillar to rot. Legend has it that the skull was filled by a swarm of bees. In Michanikos' poem, Onisilus transforms his bees into harbingers of the looming doom and becomes himself a morality tale. Heroism is admirable, but devoid of good sense, it is a recipe for disaster. Pantelis Michanikos, Onisilus. By my side stood Onisilus, straight out of history and legends, alive and breathing. He, a king most gallant, held in his hands all that he had left, a skull, his cranium, full of bees. For 10 years, Onisilus kept sending his bees to sting us, to wake us, to bring us a message. 10,000 bees Onisylus sent, and they all died on our thick skins without us feeling a thing. And when the barbarian trample reached Salamis, Onisylus raged in fury. He could not bear it anymore. He grabbed his skull and smashed it on my head. And I fell dead, inglorious, wretched, accursed by Onisylus. Onisylus, whose name in ancient Greek means the useful one, uselessly sent his warnings for 10 years. That is, since 1964, when the Greeks' apparent vindication by the United Nations as regards the intercommunal strife, a vindication that came in the form of UN Resolution 186, which legitimized Makarios' government despite the withdrawal of Turkish Cypriots and allowed for the functioning of the state under the so-called law of expediency. This complacency, this vindication cultivated a feeling of hubristic complacency among Greek Cypriots and even encouraged those elements of the GC leadership that believed that Makarios' constitutional reform, his abortive constitutional reform, could now be enforced unimpeded. The Turkish Cypriots, on their part, were plagued by their own ultra-nationalist elements, who cultivated among them the phobia that the Greeks were slowly implementing plans of ethnic cleansing, only the first chapter of which were the massacres of Turkish Cypriot non-combatants during the events of 1963-64. These massacres were probably spun by Turkish propaganda, no doubt, but of course they were no fiction. They were in fact repeated on an even grander scale in 1974 as Greek retaliation for the brutalities of the Turkish army. Michanikos' Ode to a Slain Turkish Boy is perhaps the most composite reception of T.S. Eliot's Wasteland in Greek Cypriot poetry, compressing the ghastly violence of 10 years into the serene image of a youthful body slain and lying amid a paradisal landscape. Michanikos' poem is an unforgiving flagellation of all his Cypriot compatriots, kinsmen and foreigners alike, for what was essentially a crime against humanity. Planting the seeds of destruction, that is, like Stetson in Eliot's poem, planted the corpse in his garden, planting the seeds of destruction deep into the fertile soil of Cyprus, a land, the poet's land, destined to grow fragrant flowers, but now producing rotting cadavers. Pantelis Michanikos, Ode for a Slain Turkish Boy. Stetson, you who are with me in the ships at Mylae, that corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year? T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. This plain that spreads before me brightly green, adorned with the yellow of the daisy, the red of the poppy, the smile of the violet, this plain open under the hot, bright rays of the sun, this plain whose tender touch points our soul to the way of spring, in this plain that exalts the Lord and the soul of man, in this plain that exalts the body and hums the song of man, in this plain lies slain a Turkish boy, face contorted, cut off upon the grimace of pain, a chiseled underage mask, cut off in eternity to be asking if the place was indeed too narrow in the fanfare of spring, to be asking if there are nations amongst the tribes of the daisy, ever to be asking what is the nation of the green grass. The sun warms roots and soil. Love overflows like dew in the leaves and the blossoms of the soul of man, in the open sincerity of the plain, and the chiseled, fearsome mask of a child, under the voluminous sunlight, moves its lips and speaks. Thank you. You brought me to this path. You brought me to this end. Thank you, kinsmen and strangers alike. My land, rock him sweetly to sleep with a lullaby. For you, the poet's voice, this year asks anew the big oil magnates and the colonists of cadavers, asks Stetson, that corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year? Stetson's corpse indeed sprouted in Cyprus in 1974 and filled the island with cadavers and their national and international colonists. All attempts to remove its venomous roots from the ground to solve the Cyprus problem have so far failed. Cyprus remains divided, and as more and more time passes, this division, now a de facto partition of the island between two functioning states, even if only one of these is internationally recognized, appears to be the gruesome final solution. In this short tour through the events of 1960-1974, we explored their cultural and psychological impacts through the eyes of major Greek-Cypriot poets. Feelings of devastation for the loss of beloved individuals and ancestral homes, and indignation for the horrid and unlawful aggression of a foreign power, more or less checked by introspection and self-criticism for national visions turned into nightmares, for young men made into heroes, and for heroes instrumentalized as political tools, for innocents brutalized by nationalism itself. This, ladies and gentlemen, innocents brutalized by nationalism, is the history of Cyprus, the history of my land. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Antonis, for this journey. I would say a very emotional journey through the modern history of Cyprus. You mentioned Eliot's wasteland. April is the cruelest month. This is how the wasteland of Eliot begins. We could say, I think it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that July is the cruelest month. I wouldn't say for us Greeks, I would say for the island of Cyprus, for both Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots. Now, we will receive questions. I'm afraid that those of you who have entered the platform as guests, you cannot use the chat. So if you want to address a question to Antonis, you need to use your microphone. But the others, you may use the chat or ask directly Antonis a question. Antonis, I have a question. I will give some. Oh, okay. We have a question from Olga. Yes, Olga, please use your microphone. Olga, can you hear me?
Yes, and you can.
Okay, excellent. We can't hear you clearly. Can you speak a bit more loudly?
Okay, so this one, okay, it's okay, not?
Andoni, can you hear Olga?
I'm afraid I cannot.
Oh, sorry.
A bit louder, Olga. If you...
And you, can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
I can hear, but yeah.
A bit better, but it's still faint.
Okay. So maybe I can write my question in the chat. It will be better.
That would be a better idea, I think, yes.
You could do that, although you could try, you can address your question to Antonis, and if he cannot hear you, then you can use the chat, because it was a bit better, I think, at the...
Okay, so yes, my question is, so thank you very much. Thank you very much for your lecture. It was excellent. So, but there in Russia, we don't know much about these poets. Unfortunately, we don't have books or any resources where we can read about books and poetry in Cyprus. So, can you tell us maybe some sources or internet resources where we can read poems of these poets, which you have told about? Maybe you can say where we can read poems in Greek, maybe not in English, but in Greek also it's possible.
Oh yes, there are very useful anthologies of poetry written by Greek-Cypriots. There are also many individual translations of major works in English and other languages. I can forward to you through Maria a few titles and a few websites which you can consult.
Well, thank you very much. So it was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. Anybody else? Any other questions? Andoni, you have mentioned 4 major male poets writing about the invasion and stuff. I was wondering about the female poets. Did you have a look at their poetry? I mean, we have some significant female poets writing during this period: Pitsa Halazi, Kleri Angelidou, Dina Katsouri, Eli Peonidou. So I was wondering whether we see the same distinctions in their poetry, or if you have noticed some differences, how they approach, what is their own attitude towards this situation, how do they approach it? And retell the story in their own poetry.
I would say that the general tenor is more or less the same. Kleri Angelidou writes a kind of poetry that is closer to Montis's nationalist take on the events. She does have a number of strong, quite emotional poems about the experience of displacement, about the loss of homelands, her own personal homelands, Amochostos, and so on and so forth. Pitsa Halazi is more epic in tone. She deals with more historical subjects, adopting the modernist approach closer to Charalambides and Michanikos. Dina Katsouri writes a more diverse kind of poetry, both stylistically and thematically. She comes from a different standpoint. She's leftist herself. Her approach to the events is quite distinct. Indeed, Katsouri's poetry should have been represented in today's lecture, because it does offer a different approach, a different viewpoint. Eli Peonidou, I wouldn't consider her among the major poets, but she also contributed poetry of good standing in the same general atmosphere of loss, of accusation, of desolation, of personal pain, and without the kind of self-criticism that we see in Michanikos, and we see more and more in poetry and prose written nowadays. Because nowadays there has been a turn, and this turn is personified indeed by major female literary figures, such as Konstantia Soteriou, for example, who revisit, re-examine the history of Cyprus from a perspective that could be described as a feminist, rewriting the feminist reinterpretation of the events, an interpretation of the events through the otherwise or the formerly stifled voices of women as the primary victims of nationalism and of war. So yes, I would say that Pitsa Galazi, Eli Angelidou and Eli Peonidou offer more or less the same perspective on the events as the four male poets that I singled out, but Dina Katsouri indeed could have been and should have been represented in today's lecture, because coming from a different political background, she has a distinct and personal perspective.
Thank you very much. I agree with you that Dina Katsouri has indeed a very distinct viewpoint and approach. Other questions to Antonis?
I have a question.
Yeah.
That's okay. So, Antonis, thank you very much for this. That was very rich and informative for all of us. I have a question, a very general one. Well, you included two poems which, at least 2 poems which refer to the history of ancient Cyprus and ancient history and literature, I guess, in general. So, and that was one by Charalambides and another one by Michanikos. We had the references to Cypriots, so Nisilos and Pnitagoras, I think. If there isn't anything else which I'm missing right now. So my question is quite related to some of our students' probably interests as well. So here we can see references to Greek literature, Greek history through the ages. So how would this use of the ancient Greek tradition help us understand better these poems, and probably do you think that does make a major contribution to the way these poets would like to present their own perspective to the modern history of Cyprus?
Thank you, Chrysanthi. The recent periods of the most recent periods of Greek-Cypriot poetry, the period which we could call modernist, was inaugurated, in fact, by a poet who wasn't Cypriot himself, by George Seferis, one of the patriarchs of modern Greek poetry, a Nobel laureate himself, who in 1955 published a celebrated poetry collection called Logbook 3. This collection memorialized Seferis's journeys to Cyprus and his personal understanding of the contemporary Cypriot experience by way of Eliot's mythical methods. So Seferis constructs a universe, a poetic universe, in which time present and time past, to quote Eliot, time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. Seferis constructs a continuum of history and geography that connects modern-day Cyprus with the Cyprus of earlier periods, which connects the geography, the isolated geography of these islands with the wider Greek world, which connects the modern versions of the Greek language with the more dated ones, and creates a vision of the present and the future that is polysemous and polyvalent. And in this vision, the ancient figures coexist, cooperate, co-function with the modern day individuals. Like Onisilus in this poem coexists with the poetic eye, a modern day Greek. The most competent continuator of Seferis in Cypriot literature, the most competent continuators in plural of Seferis in Cypriot literature are indeed Pantelis Michanikos and Charalambides. Michanikos died relatively young, did not publish much, but Charalambides, 80 years old this year, is still going strong, and his poetry creates a most rich and most fertile territory populated by all kinds of events, all kinds of personages, all kinds of linguistic forms from all different periods of Greek history, a constructed continuum, no doubt. This is an ideology, not a historical fact, a constructed continuum that by way of its own constructedness speaks volumes. So in modernist Greek poetic writings, there is no distinction between past, present, and future. There is no distinction between the ancient kings of Salamis and the modern displaced inhabitants of Amochustos. The specters or the visions of the past are present, walking on the shores of the island, shaking hands with their contemporary, with the modern contemporaries, and instructing us with the hallowed glory of their time-honored perspective. This continuum is, has only been examined today through Michanikos' poem, but it is present also in some poetry by Montis and in other major poets of Cyprus, apart from Charalambides, like Kostas Vasiliou and Pitsagalazi, mentioned before, and others. I don't know if my answer was clear enough.
Yeah, it was very illuminating. Thank you very much.
Yes, this is what Seferis and Eliot first, and then Seferis called the mythical method. Ritsos, Yannis Ritsos, another major Greek poet that influenced modern Cypriot poetry, spoke of a different kind of coexistence between past and present in poetry. He spoke of the poetic past being a fourth dimension of time-space continuum, a fourth dimension. So the poets of Cyprus, the Greek poets of Cyprus, had various blueprints to take advantage of when they reconstructed their own version of Cyprus history, in which time present and time past were conflated.
Thank you very much, Antonis. I don't know whether we have any other question. Okay, we could close just a tiny question from, we do have Stefanos. Stefanos, okay, you can use your microphone. Yeah, we can hear you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much for that very emotional and nostalgic journey through the history of Cyprus in these critical years. And as you were going through the different poems and the different sort of perspectives of the poets, from what I can see, the poets are sort of commenting, as it were, from a standpoint. They're sort of both within and without, and sort of away from the struggle, and so they can sort of, you know, comment on these atrocities and be quite, you know, self-reflective and self-critical at times. But I'm wondering, especially about this poem here from Michanikos that we've got up, the Onesilos. I'm wondering what the sort of message here actually is. So what the figure of Onesilos represents in this poem. So what I mean is that it's to ascertain the poet's own kind of views on what really should have happened, maybe what the kind of Cypriots should have done. And so I'm wondering what the figure of Onesilos here, who, as we know, whose aim was to kind of revolt against the Persians, kind of unite the island. And here you've got Onesilos sending bees to sort of, as it were, warn the Cypriots during this 10-year period. So what these kind of warnings represent, and if Michanikos is taking the view that, you know, with Onesilos we should aim more towards henosis.
Yeah. Thank you, Stefanos, for a very incisive question. I wouldn't want to reduce the poem to a single interpretation. No less because, historically speaking, Onesilos' figure is itself quite ambiguous. Onesilos perpetrated a coup d'etat against the king of Salamis, his brother, in order to grasp power and push Cyprus into the Ionian revolt, disregarding the balance of power on the island and practically leading the Cyprus army to destruction. Mm-hmm. So he's a heroic figure, but he's also a catastrophic figure as well. So this is one piece of information that one may utilize in order to interpret the poem. Another piece of information is that this 10-year period alluded to by the poem is, of course, the period between the end of the first round, as it were, of intercommunal strife until the 1974 invasion. In this period, something critical happened, and it happened on the political level. This critical event was the fact that initially the United Nations vindicated Makarios for his attempt to enforce constitutional reform. And they vindicated Makarios, as I mentioned in my lecture, by way of a UN resolution number 186 that legitimized his government, despite the fact that the constitution, the 1960 constitution, practically had gone into disrepair by the fact that the Turkish Cypriots had seceded. So we have an international event that pushes the Greek Cypriots into the kind of complacency that sends them the erroneous and dangerous message that they are safe on the ground, that they can do pretty much whatever they want without any danger coming from outside whatsoever. That international law and the international community are on their side, that right with a capital R is on their right, is on their side. So this is a second piece of information that we can keep to interpret this poem. A third piece of information is the barbarian trample, as the poet calls it. Mm-hmm. This barbarian trample is the fact that more and more Turkey exhibited its readiness to engage in military operations in Cyprus. It exhibited its disregard for the NATO alliance, and it should have proven to the Greeks that they cannot act unopposed, that they can no longer disregard the Turkish factor in Cyprus. Because ever since 1955, the Greeks unfolded their own personal strategy in pursuit of their national aspirations, as if the Turks did not exist, as if there would not be any counteraction on the part of the Turks, as if any move on our chessboard would be unopposed, as if we played a game of chess by ourselves. So I would not like to answer your question by offering a monosyllabus, unitary interpretation of Michanikos' poem, but by reiterating some of the historical data that should go into interpreting it. I hope I answered satisfactorily.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and Antonis, just a final question by me. I mean, in the Poetics, Aristotle says that poetry is more philosophical than history because, unlike history that merely catalogs the past, poetry speaks more of universals, and also, whereas history only records what happened, poetry records and tell us what may have happened. So my question is, what do these poems, the poems that we went through, according to your opinion, add that is missing from our history books? And we can close with this.
Yeah. In a book on Charalambides' poetry that is about to be published, hopefully this year, Professor Michalis Pashiardis calls Charalambides, Kyriakos Charalambides, the most Aristotelian of Greek-Cypriot poets. And he calls him so exactly for the reason that you mentioned, because Charalambides' poetry is a philosophical reiteration, reinscription of history. What do these poems add? Each poet is quite different than the next one, but Michanikos is an especially interesting case because he adds a different kind of rage into the psychological reception of the events. Rage, not against the machine, as Montis does, for example, and by machine I mean the international powers that supposedly conspired against Cyprus and against the rights of the Greeks, but against the internal and internalized machinations of his own countrymen against themselves. Michanikos is probably the first poet in the history of Cyprus literature that vocalizes his that vocalizes criticism against Makarios himself. Makarios, especially since his death in 1977, was a saint-like figure, and he was practically made into a saint by the official discourses that were, of course, controlled by his own people. And in poems like We Vipers, Michanikos, very early, and while Makarios was still alive, implicitly, mind you, but still quite distinctly brings this self-critical note that brings to bear this self-critical note that includes Makarios on our reading of the events. In a time when the outrage of the invasion, and especially the outrage of the coup d'etat, kept stifling any voice of opposition against Makarios, because any voice of opposition was regarded as a voice of support for the perpetrators of the coup d'etat, and thus as a more or less treacherous voice. Michanikos is poetically daring enough. Michanikos, who was a civil servant to boot, is poetically daring enough to utter such kind of criticism. There's another poet, less efficient, less competent than Michanikos, but still a major one, Theoclis, who does more or less the same, perhaps even more daringly so, but a few years later. Michanikos' deposition was published in 1975. Michanikos was not a leftist. He was a civil servant. And being a civil servant in 1975 meant that your freedom of speech was quite curbed by your official capacity. And still, Michanikos enriched our historical understanding of those events with this kind of daring, with this kind of honesty and sincerity that Cypriot historians would take quite a few years more to introduce into the official narrative of the events.
Many thanks, Antonis. Many thanks to everyone for being here with us, for joining us in this journey. We will meet again next Saturday at the same time and place. Many thanks. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Antonis. Thanks, everybody.